Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Transport is a regular feature on the pod, and the rail network across Wales has been known to feature. Perhaps that's because of how important it is both for connectivity, but also for the economy and, of course, its political position. The last decade seems to have been dominated by talk for South Wales Metro, often to the angst of the rest of Wales, and HS2 consequentials loom large in all political debate. At the centre of this has been Mark Barry, the developer of the initial South Wales Metro plan, and now a professor in practice at Cardiff University. Through no small efforts, Mark has pushed the South Wales Metro to the forefront of the agenda in Wales and got funding to deliver a real step change in provision. He has recently published a book on his experience, How to Build a Metro, and he joins us tonight to talk about all things rail in Wales. Hi, Mark.
Well, good evening, and thank you for having me on. And I hope we can go more than just rail. I mean, we do the transport thing as well.
I think we'll touch on other stuff. It'll be integrated transport, if you will.
Gosh, you've read the buzzwords tonight. That's
great. So thanks again for joining us, Mark. Starting at the top, your book, How to Build a Metro. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, one of the things I wanted to do over the last few years is tell a bit of the story, especially the backroom story, from my perspective, because I've been involved in the Metro since 2010, and I ended up working in Welsh Government for a short period. And I think what people often see when they see a big project, they see the people with the spades in their hands doing all the engineering work and the digging and all the kind of running the rolling stock. But at some point, a politician makes a decision to spend an awful lot of money. And what people often don't understand is there's often years before that point where people are agitating, shaking the tree, having conversations, trying to get to a point where a politician is able to act on advice given to make a decision to spend a great deal of money, public money, on a project like the Metro. So I wanted to kind of share some of my experience of that process, because I think it's little known in terms of how the civil service works and how advocacy is important. But I also added to that a kind of, I've learned an awful lot in the last 15 years. When, if you bear in mind, when I started this journey, I wasn't a transport planner. I wasn't a public servant. I wasn't a civil servant. I just left the bar technology company that I've been chief executive of, and I've been running, having founded in 2003. So I've learned a great deal about transport planning and about some of the principles around how you develop transport schemes, how you run a railway, light rail versus heavy rail. I've learned about the devolve powers issue and all those things. And I wanted to write down some of that learning, and I hope in a easy to understand format, although it is quite a long book and it's quite niche. So to add to my story, I wanted to add some kind of learnings along the way. And I concluded with, well, I've been involved in 15 years now, and I've been involved with Welsh Government as well, helping to build a framework for schemes all over Wales, saying this is what we need to do in the next 15 years. And these are the issues and challenges we need to overcome to try and make that happen. So it was really a combination of things. What I did, what we need to do, and why we're doing it, basically.
So how exactly does someone who works in biotech end up being one of Wales's leading authority on trains?
Well, it's an interesting one. So if I go back to when I was about 2 years into biotech, I met an old friend from mine because I worked in London. He says, how the hell did you get involved in biotech? You were a management consultant working in IT. So my background is quite weird. I've had 3 careers, very different careers, but they're all linked by certain things. So I started my career as a technical author with Ferranti Computer Systems in Manchester in 1987. I spent a year and a half, it was quite dull to be honest, writing maintenance manuals for power station control systems. The Toness power stations, it turns out, in Scotland. Then I moved to London and I got involved in software design, managing software development teams. I became a development manager in a software house. I then moved into management consultancy, managing big programs, not just IT, for big corporates, working in the US and working in Europe. And I left that and decided to come back to Cardiff, when I was doing very well in London, to do something. I joined the Welsh Development Agency, and there's a little section of my book on technology commercialisation, as it happens, from higher education. I was asked to leave the WDA because I had some fallings out with some people, right? Mainly because I was trying to start a business with their help. And that's what I ended up doing. I ended up raising money for a biotechnology startup company called QChip in Cardiff with 2 colleagues, David Barrow, who stood at the university, I think, and Joe Daniels. And we took a bit of IP from university and over a few years raised a few £1 million in equity finance. But as often happens in startup companies, as I learned through my naivety, founders very rarely end up staying in the company. New investors come in, you get basically diluted by new share offerings, and you wonder what the hell happened. But after 6 years, I was kind of squeezed out, as it happens. But I'd never changed that experience. Being an entrepreneur, starting a company, raising money, you learn a great deal about the world, people, individuals, yourself as well. And then I got into what perhaps I should always have done. I was always interested in economic performance of South East Wales, transport. I grew up in Grangetown, although I was 20 odd years away and working in university. And I thought, damn it, this place needs something like a metro because we've got terrible transport. I've lived in Manchester, I've seen the Metrolink, I've lived in London, I've been in Milan. And that really drove me to start agitating for better transport. Now, as it happens, because of my background in the business community, I wasn't constrained by working in the civil service or local authorities. I ended up knowing people like the guy who founded Admiral Insurance, David Stevens. My brother, as you probably know, is a business editor at the Western Mail. So I had a lot of good contacts. And I ended up working with the Cardiff Business Partnership, and Cardiff Council helped, in the background to that as well, because they were keen for better transport in Cardiff and the region. I ended up writing this report saying our transport's a bit crap. The best cities in the world have got good transport. Why can't we have it? Here's some ideas. It's going to cost a bit of money. It will take some political will and some bravery and some confidence. And we really ought to do this because if we don't do this, what are we for, kind of thing. That caught the imagination and dragged me into the public eye, I guess, on what the metro might be. I did my first live TV interview on radio BBC Wales with Nick Savini, younger Nick Savini in 2011. And the rest, they say, is history. I've been involved in it ever since.
I'm sure we could talk for hours about the need to have integrated, better connectivity in also my home city as well. I can always remember being a child and having a dentist appointment in Robina and having to get a bus into town to get back out to Robina. It was always a long-held issue for me. But speaking now on the metro, Transport for Wales has nearly delivered phase 1 now.
Yeah.
What can passengers expect to see? Is it new units, electrification, new stations? What do you imagine is part of this whole process?
And one thing I would say is no one got everything they wanted on the metro, which we get in, but everybody got some of what they wanted, right? Which is good. So if you live on the core valley lines, and to be clear for your listeners, it's not the whole of the lines in South East Wales. What's happened is Welsh Government, via Transport for Wales, have taken responsibility for the core valley line asset, which is the lines that run north of Queen Street up to Caerphilly, the Corrigan line, up to Pontypridd, then up to Merthyr, to Herbert Aberdare, and most of the city line. So that core network. That is being upgraded to allow more capacity for electrification, to essentially double the service frequency, certainly to the heads of the valleys and through Pontypridd, to allow rolling stock with better performance characteristics that can move faster, so you can squeeze a timetable up. So if you're in Pontypridd, you get 5 or 6 trains an hour. It takes half an hour to Cardiff. We're going to be potentially having 12 tram trains an hour from Pontypridd to Cardiff, taking 25 minutes. If you live in Merthyr, it's probably an hour, maybe over an hour sometimes, and best 2 trains an hour. That'll go to 4 trains an hour or 4 tram trains an hour as we get in, taking about maybe 50 minutes or just under. So reduced journey times, faster journeys. More importantly, this is the really important thing about urban transit, it's all about frequency. And there's an old adage in transport planning, which I've learned, is nobody waits half an hour for the 15-minute trip, right? So from Pontypridd or below, you really need at least 4 services an hour. That's how the Manchester Metrolink works, the Newcastle Metro works. So pretty much most of that network is going to be getting at least 4, if not 6 or more an hour. The only places that don't, and this is the real bugbear of mine, which I've written about, is there are big chunks of line in Cardiff, like the City line and Corrigan line, whereas actually the highest latent population and population density for rapid transit being stuck at 2 trains an hour. Now, I understand some of the reasons for that and some of the politics and some of the engineering challenges, but we've kind of made a rod for our own back there. And that's one of the priorities in terms of the next phase of work, to fix that. Otherwise, if you're in Robina, you're not going to wait half an hour for the trip. You're going to get in your car and get a bus. Now, nothing wrong with either of those, but we need to encourage people to use effective rapid transit and then use our buses for things better than competing with suboptimal rail services. They can do those vehicle kilometres elsewhere. So it's going to be really, really good for very many people in the valleys, certainly the valleys from Pontypridd north to Merthyr, to Herbert Aberdare. And actually, I think there's a lot of cynicism out there. You may remember there was a story where I was quoted at the Cardiff Council scrutiny meeting where I joked about my mother not believing in a metro because people are cynical. And the headlines of the Western Mail the next day, Metro experts' mother does not believe in metro. I got a phone call from Transport for Wales saying, what the hell are you telling the press? I said, well, I'm making a point. We've never had anything new and shiny, right? So until you show people can get on it, then they're not going to believe it. So I think The real test is going to be probably it's 12 to 18 months when we have the full range of services operating, I hope, and the frequencies are there, and the new timetable with the shorter journey times is there, and people will go, oh, this is a bit different, and that will begin, I think, to turn the dial and reduce some of the cynicism that I think is natural to expect.
I think cynicism is the right word, isn't it, though? I think there's a natural inbuilt Welsh cynicism about anything, specifically about infrastructure projects. So, again, thinking on cynicism, the degree to which there is some cynicism about the project from other areas of, well, Wales, but also South Wales, because how much of this is going to be benefiting Cardiff versus sort of the rest of South Wales?
Well, it's going to benefit the valleys the most because that's where most of the new services and uplift are. So, I remember I've had these conversations about, oh, it'll drag people to Cardiff. Well, there's already 80 odd thousand people traveling to Cardiff, and they're generally in a car. So one of the things we have to do is give them, a carbon friendly, responsible option to not use their car. So the first thing is about mode shift. The second thing is, if you look at the flows of people, irrespective of what mode they're traveling in, there's a lot of trips in and out of Cardiff, but a lot of trips across the valleys, from Pontypridd to Rhondda, Pontypridd to Aberdare. It's about making trips anywhere and everywhere more easy, convenient on public transport. And I hope, this is one of the things that's missing in the current plans because there's no organisation leading on this. How do we then, with the investment in the transport network, encourage that development response in that we build more stuff around our transport network, so transit-oriented development, as we call it, houses, public services, retail, offices, rather than being based in car-based locations, put them around a metro network. And there's been a couple of studies in the last few years about the impact of car-based retail, especially on our high streets. And this is one of the reasons I counter people who say the metros are about Cardiff. No, it's the biggest impact on the economies of our high streets in the valleys. It's not a few thousand people commuting to Cardiff. It's the ripping out of high streets, replacing independent traders with corporate shed car-based retail on the edge of town, often employing people on zero-hour contracts or low pay, with all the value extracted to a balance sheet in London. The only place that's bucked that trend, if you know, and you know the valleys, is Treorchy to a certain extent, because topologically, it's isolated from the impact of supermarkets. So most of its, 1970s high street retailers are still there. It's not full of hipster coffee shops, but it's full of independent retailers. And the value therein is retained locally. What I hope the Metro can do is stimulate the conversation about how we can put more stuff back around our stations, our transit networks, how we can encourage the large footprint retailers with out-of-town facilities to repurpose some of that space and put some of it back where they really ought to be in our communities and not on the edge of our communities.
I mean, to the listeners who haven't visited Treorchy High Street, they really should. I think it's won awards for being one of the best high streets certainly in Wales, if not the UK, and it is incredible.
UK 2019 High Streets of the Year, and I do a really good example with students. I do a compare and contrast Tonopandi, which is only 7 miles away, with Treorchy. And at Tonopandi High Street, I've been there. It's a great cafe called the Cwtch Cafe. You get a nice coffee. It's nice. But there are boarded up shops, lots of initiatives to try and regenerate it. But, you walk another, 400 metres from the high street and you then come across the large Asda with its huge car park, which has, it's blindly obvious to anyone who's asking about the high street what the answer is. We've abdicated the space and moved it because of the convenience as we get as individuals to car-based locations of retail locations and supermarkets. The same is true of office space. And I think it's also terribly sad that many of our public services followed suit and built offices and hospitals in places you can only get to with a car. That is bonkers. I mean, we've got to turn that back. And the Metro, for me, should be a catalyst for a developmental regeneration response over the next 20 years, which starts rebuilding our communities around our transit network and our high streets, because we can and we ought to, and we used to do that anyway.
Speaking of transit-based retail or business opportunities, something I know that we both support is the Cardiff Parkway.
Yeah.
For those who don't necessarily know much about it or know why we both feel so strongly about it, why do you back that project?
Right. So there's a couple of reasons. If you look at the transport need of people living in the east of Cardiff, right, there isn't a station on the whole east of Cardiff. You've got a city of 400,000, 200,000 people on one side of the city don't have access to a station, really. And part of the problem with the M4 congestion is anyone who's going east, in the east of Cardiff, will typically hop in a car on the M4. So having more stations in the east of the city provides an alternative. If you live in St Mellons and you're struggling to get to work, the bus service takes an hour sometimes to get into the middle of Cardiff. So put in a station at St Mellons, even though it's not right in the middle of the estate, will provide a vital public service to a huge number of people in the east of Cardiff who could get to Parkway, be it by bike, by bus, or even drive as a park and ride to go to other places, to Cardiff, to Bristol, to London. I think the more important conversation about the business park proposition, which I know some even well-known politicians have been, opposed to, and I've had those conversations. One of the challenges we have along the M4 corridor is a huge amount of office space, which is completely car dependent, right? Cardiff Gate, Celtic Springs, Imperial Parks, and then you get the Sputty Parks in Newport. You get, Langstone Business Park. Now, what we need to be doing and trying to do is encouraging some of that office floor space back to public transport connected places. Now, ideally, city centres. And Newport could do it, but the ONS or the patent office move into the city centre. But also, there are some occupiers who either don't or can't be in city centres because they need some logistics, activity of biotech, pharma, business park stuff. Now, we haven't got a public transport connected business park that's not in a city centre. What Parkway offers is a very unique place that could support those kind of occupiers who can't go to a city centre, who want to be next to public transport, who would otherwise have to go to Cardiff Gate or Imperial Park or Celtic Springs and be 100% car dependent. So Parkway, for me, is a massive opportunity. And I've got to say, hats off to Andrew and Nigel Roberts for 15 years been trying to make that happen. And they put a lot of their own personal money into developing this programme. Maybe they're going to have to modify their plans somewhat, given the market we're in now. But I hope the planning issue is resolved quickly, because that for me has got in a way of focusing on the real issue, i.e. financing the station and who should finance that. But I think it'll be a vital investment in both the economy of South East Wales, in a sustainable economy of South East Wales, because it's public transport connected, but also for lots of people living in the east of Cardiff who don't really have a choice if they're going further afield than maybe the city centre on a bus to get in anything but a car. So it cries out for being progressed as quickly as possible.
So for those who, maybe not as well versed in Parkway politics as me and you, Mark, this is primarily privately financed, isn't it? But there's also been a long running planning issue. Would you mind telling people about that as well?
Well, two things. I'm not going to speak for the people involved. Is it fully privately financed? I don't know. I think the plan was prior to COVID, that was a likely scenario. I think the whole financing of the station and the kind of station you want and the kind of services that will stop there, and what Welsh Government's relationship with any arrangement will have to be looked at. But I think the first thing to do is get the planning issue out of the way, because all that's basically preventing anyone making any progress on whatever financial arrangement needs to be put in place to make the station happen.
So it was approved by Cardiff Council, wasn't it? But then it was being called in.
It was called in, and I'm not going to, comment. I think we know why. It was quite maybe an overzealous response to a local planning approval, based upon reasons that I understand. But I think, there's no perfection in the world. You have to make compromises in terms of the environment to make progress. And I think the real problem has been the decision hasn't come. It's been 2 years. So if you're going to get on the pot, you know what you have to do with it, don't you? Right? Or get off it. And I think the problem has been everyone's been in this kind of like, what's happening for 2 years. So let's get that out of the way. If it's going to be killed, kill it so we can move on. I think that would be a terrible thing to do. I don't think there's any justification on a planning basis to stop it. Then move on to how we might fund it. And I think my view is personally, it only really works at the station when you do the other burn stations and the extra services to Bristol. That gives you the option of a lower cost station rather than the fully full platform station. Again, I'm not speaking for those promoting the scheme, but from my perspective, looking at the overall transport issues in South East Wales, we need those extra Bristol Temple-Mead services, or Cheltenham or whatever they're from. We need those extra stations on the South Wales mainland so that people along the corridor have the option of going east and west from those places without getting a car, which today they predominantly will do. So Newport East, Newport West, Llanwern, Maindy, Cardiff East, Newport Road and Parkway are all vital to that and will make an enormous difference to people's mode choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I live in Roath, and if I had that Newport Road station, it would completely revolutionise my transport options.
So yeah, well, I live in Roath. I'm just off the wreck here, and it's like I'm waiting for a Cruise Road station. That's been delayed. I want that. I may have moved out by the time they build it. Who knows? So,
Speaking about another Cardiff project, there's those non-Cardiff listeners. We will get to other projects, don't worry.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's a big thing about Cardiff Crossrail at the minute as well.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so what, for the benefit of our listeners who aren't as Cardiff centric as maybe me and you, Mark, what is Cardiff Crossrail? And, there's been a lot of issue, oh, not a lot of issue, but a lot of concern about the price as well, given the line.
Well, the thing is, I think it's been misrepresented or misunderstood or miscommunicated. The concept for the Crossrail is a full east-west link, high capacity, from northwest Cardiff, City Line, into the city, down to the bay and out to the east, providing a high capacity, high quality, fast, rapid transit service, maybe offering 6 trams or 6 services an hour. To build something like that from new, 20 kilometres and if you include the Circle Line as well, that's part of the concept. To build something that long, 20 kilometres from new, offering that extra capacity, will cost you £2 or £3 billion. That's the reality. Because we've got lots of unused rail infrastructure, right? We've got two trains an hour on the City Line. We've got no Circle connection. Quarter Line is not well utilised. And we've got the Bay Line and we've got some old freight lines. We could stitch it all together, upgrade it for probably a third or at most of that, and create a very unique transit network that could be form the backbone of an integrated transport network. The fundamental keystone of that project is that phase 1A from the Bay Line up to Cardiff Central. Because one of the issues we have at Cardiff Central, if you talk to the rail guys, and it's a real problem now, there's no more platform capacity. With the new metro services coming in, it's already on a tipping point. And we already know with the extra South Wales mainline services coming in, they're not even sure they can manage all of those. So what the Crossrail will do, especially not just the link to the station, when we connect to the west, so we go up what we call the station link, the ramp, can connect to the City Line, and when we fix the City Line and all those kind of things, you can run more tram trains away from the current platforms of Cardiff Central, down the Crossrail platforms to the Bay. And so people have to view that first section not as a standalone scheme. Because if it was just a standalone scheme for £100 million for 800 metres, you might say, oh, that's not really good value for money. But what people have to understand, and I don't think it's been communicated as well, although I've tried in various blogs, it is a key component of that bigger scheme, which will deliver enormous benefits in terms of economic development opportunities, regeneration opportunities, but more importantly, massive, high quality, fast, rapid transit, public transport capacity across the city that we don't have today. And will give people who would otherwise not get on a tram at Corriton or Ely Mill or Birchgrove or Warngrove or wherever, well, I've got one of these things every 10 minutes now. I'll go and wait at the station. The other thing that allows you to do in Cardiff, I will shut up in a minute, is that I got a problem with, we're talking about bus reform and integration of rail and bus. And really no one's done that outside London in a kind of formal, objective way since the 1980s because of the deregulation. So the last person in South Wales to have done that is probably 87 years old now, right? And they're not looking for work. So we have a lot of bus companies, and they work very hard in very difficult circumstances trying to compete with traffic. But they all design their own networks without really thinking about integrating. The apps are all operator-based. They don't mix with rail, they don't mix with other bus operators. Part of the challenge is developing a fully integrated system and then redesigning our bus network so we don't have suboptimal bus services competing with suboptimal rail services. We have the rail services doing the heavy lifting because the capacity is much greater. And we have bus services operating in a way that augments or integrates or feeds that. Very much in the same way the Newcastle Metro was designed in the early 1980s. So if you know your history on transit, there's a section of the book on that. They took a lot of old railways, upgraded it, created a Newcastle Metro. Because buses were still under public control, they stopped all the buses running to the centre of Newcastle, built bus rail interchanges around the network. Those buses fed into the Metro network, fed into the middle of Newcastle. That network by 1985 was carrying 50 million passengers a year. Following bus deregulation, it fell to below 30. I mean, it just fragmented because everybody was competing and nobody wanted to work together. So part of, for me, the Crossrail, augmenting the CVL, provides a really good backbone to hang off your more kind of capillary type bus services. So the rail becomes the arteries of the system and the bus network should become the capillaries. And this is really what Crossrail is all about. That first phase is the kind of fundamental step on the way to this kind of much more sophisticated transport network that we probably make another 10 years to do it, 15 years. But if we don't take that first step, it will never happen.
The integration of transport is something I've thought about for an awful long time because I used to live in London, and like you said, whilst London is no panacea in terms of public transport, it certainly feels more connected. The fact that you could use your Oyster or your debit card to switch almost seamlessly between bus and tube or bus and train in many instances as well across London
Yeah.
having moved back to Cardiff, it always felt like we were slightly behind in that regard of making it easy for passengers. And as we all know, if you really want to compete with the sort of freedom of the car, then you need to make public transport as easy as is physically possible. So it is interesting what you say on bus networks in that regard, Mark. But I mean, the one thing we're now waiting for, of course, in terms of bus networks, is the bus re-regulation bill, the bus bill, the much fabled bus bill that we've been waiting many, many years for in Wales. So what's your thought on that? And do you think,
Well, I think that's essential because you need to be able to design a network and ignore the modes and deploy the right modes in the right place. Now, most of the rail is fixed to where it is. The bus networks need to integrate with that and feed it, or allow us to run bus miles in places where there's no rail rather than competing with rail. The challenge, of course, integration is very hard because since deregulation in the 1980s and the competition rules that were put in place around it, it made it actually illegal for bus companies to cooperate on working together. The industry was designed to not integrate because of what happened in the 80s. So London never had that. So, Transport for London was able to manage, and there were still private bus operators, but they were running to a contract that was specified in terms of where they went and the performance characteristics by TfL. And the bus network was designed by the Transport Planning Department of TfL. What we have now is bus companies planning their own networks. And because of the commercial imperative, they're overwhelmingly likely to favour the routes that have the most passengers, where the most money is. And so it's very difficult then without public subsidy, which has had to have happened, to provide the routes that I guess not as profitable. I mean, of course, we've had in the last 8 or 9 years an increasing level of public subsidy and challenges on providing a more equitable service to places where maybe the population doesn't support a bus service every half an hour or every hour or so. So I do think it's a challenge, but there's also a challenge for government here. If you're going to run more stuff, rail or bus, it's not free, right? So you have choices. How do we fund the extra stuff? And then you get into these existential questions about, well, how are we going to fund, just the rail services? Have we made choices to make our rail network on the metro more expensive than it needs to be? If you read my book, you'll know that we have made choices. If we've only got a certain amount of finance, how do we run the bus services we want? And why are we subsidising car use so much and not making car users more accountable and responsible for the cost they discharge on everyone else in society without having to pay for it? So you would end up forcing yourself down a road in terms of more public subsidy for public transport in addressing some of the subsidies we give other modes of transport. So I think the whole bus reform is seen as one part of it. You can't possibly reform the bus network with just the legislation. There's going to need to be money as well. Yeah, we're getting more economies of scale by integrating bus and rail, and we're really good operators and bringing the private sector experience in and not killing it with public sector overheads. We'll do better, but ultimately it's going to require more operational subsidy because it's going to cost more to run, and that's a challenge.
have you ever been in favour of free buses? I mean, a large percentage of bus fares already in Wales are concessionary, so paid for by the state. But do you think that would help in terms of modal shift?
No, because it's a little model. If you, a little section of the book, if you run a bus service, for example, and it's full and it's half cost paid for by the fare payer, the other half subsidy, do you make that all free so you double your subsidy? Or with the extra money you've clearly got, rather than make it free, do you double the amount of capacity you have? Right? Now, the problem, of course, if you make something free, it still costs to operate. The incremental cost of expansion becomes prohibitive. Now, I think there's a conversation about what is the right fare, but to make something free to the passenger means ultimately the cost to the taxpayer, to government, without another source of revenue to service it, becomes almost impossible. So I'm very much of the view that we've got to be really honest about this, and you can't make it all free. I'd even argue the case that the old person's the senior rail card, which I now have, is I think that shouldn't be free either. Maybe have a flat £1 charge, because what happened over the last 10 years since it was introduced, a lot of bus operators, and I don't blame them, have started reconfiguring the networks to maximise the number of concessionary fares they're capturing and then claiming that back, and doing less perhaps of the economically useful stuff. Whereas there's young people who are trying to get to school or work or employment who have to pay a proportionally high amount of their income on transport, not getting the kind of support I think we should be targeting. So I'd be saying, take the support away from people like me, and I do use it, and I will, if I've got it, I will use it. Give me a flat fee or an annual kind of fee to use the card, maybe £100 a year or something. but then use some of the what's saved to help young people. But don't make it free because any revenue, any extra money we get in government, we need to be increasing capacity, not subsidising what we've got because we don't have enough now. We need net zero. Wales tells us we need 3 times more public transport by 2040. And you can't make it free if it's now to do that.
So Lee Waters always said that he was basically going to make bus fares all £1 in Wales before the Truss mini budget. Do you think that would have been the right call?
I mean, the number one can argue about, but I mean, I think a flat fare or makes it easier. You're going to get it gets bumpy when you're working out trying to apportion the cost versus the operational cost and look at the P&L of certain operations. But the passengers don't care about that. I do think a flat fee or zone, simplifying the fare structure, I think is one thing we have to do. You can argue about the number. Is it £1, £1.50, £2? You can go around and let people with the calculators to work that out. The principle should be simplified fare structures, multimodal pay as you go. So in urban areas, you should be able to pay tap and go, as we now have on the metros, the CVR and on the bus, but they're not joined together. Have that easy tap and go, cap fare, so you can travel within a zone and you're not going to pay more than a certain amount, like you do in London. So I think we should work towards that. And I do think there was an intent in Welsh Government to do that about 3 years ago. And I do think that the Truss budget basically screwed the amount of block grant coming over from Westminster, which pulled the rug from under them. So I think the principle was right, the intent was right. Whether the number was right, you can argue about, but it got blown up by Westminster.
There are local authorities who are considering implementing congestion charges.
Yeah.
One either, I want your view on whether that's the right thing to do, but also a lot of them are saying that they would use that revenue to then pay down the cost of their bus network. What's your view on that?
I think I wouldn't call it a congestion charge. I just call it charge of using the car because of the externalities. People tell me, we're not subsidised, we pay our tax. I think the total amount of excess of fuel duty collected in the UK is about £30 billion a year. The cost of just road traffic accidents, if you add unreported costs according to the DFT, is over 40 billion. Yeah, there's VAT as well. But if you then add, cost of air quality impacts on health, right? Yeah, the cost of carbon emissions, the long-term cost of low-density sprawl, the decimation of our high streets because of car-based retail, the cost of cars, which are now getting bigger and heavier, by the way, causing more wear and tear on the road. They're not getting smaller and lighter. I think deserves some sort of fee to use a car to cover some of the costs that drivers aren't paying. And then use that to support public transport, be it, revenue support, or maybe creating a capital fund to build more of the stuff we need. Politically, that's very difficult. I can say that, not being a politician. And politicians might privately believe some of this, but no, it's very, very difficult in a world where just reducing the speed limit, just 20 miles an hour, generated this febrile response, not based on any evidence whatsoever. So I can see how difficult it is, but we are going to have to kind of close that loop somehow and start disincentivizing car use and encouraging public transport use.
You pretty much guessed my next question. Obviously, you're not a politician, but I mean, there does seem to be a trepidation now, I think, amongst governments of all political hue to do anything more that seems like it's anti-motorist. Whilst they have to start helping us with modal shift, they don't necessarily want to lose an election and then hand the keys of government over to a party that is completely opposed to this. So there does have to be some sort of balancing act or graduality to this implementation.
I get that. We're human beings, and we're not very collectively. We're pretty stupid, right? And we have to deal with the politics of that. I'm very disappointed in certain politicians who once supported this and for political ends decided to use misinformation and misrepresent data. And a lot of people are still very anti 20 miles an hour, despite the fact that it clearly reduces the number of accidents, the severity of accidents, and the costs to the health service, but also, in year savings. I also think that governments have got a responsibility to communicate more effectively the benefits and also communicate actually how we're subsidising car use. Now, we have a car in the family. I'm not anti-car, right? We use a car. I was in a car. I had to go to Bristol last night because, got my son because of the rail issue. I'm not anti-car. I'm anti so much car. And I absolutely am convinced, given most trips, the vast majority of trips in a car are less than 2 or 3 miles in urban areas. That's where we should focus. I don't want to penalise people in rural areas who don't have a choice. I mean, they shouldn't be paying anything punitive. But if you're getting in a massive SUV that's petrol powered, and there's only one of you in it, and you're going to get your chips from Albany Road or whatever it is, then you should be paying a premium for that, frankly, because there's wear and tear. It causes more congestion, you're polluting the atmosphere, and contributing to more accidents. We need to communicate that and ask people to think about making more responsible choices. Now, maybe I'm being an idealist in that, and the politics will never let that happen. But I really hope, Darren Miller's now taken up the chair in the Conservative Party. We can get back to having an honest conversation about how we do these things. And yet there'll be compromises, and we got to, recognise that, some roads should have been at 30 and not 20. Sort those out. But ultimately, lower speed limits are saving lives and saves money, as will other measures to improve the public realm, as would more public transport. I always tell people when I ever go on my cycle as well, and I was on our new bike lane earlier. Fantastic. Well done, Cardiff Council. Would you prefer I wasn't on my bike? Would you prefer I was in the car in traffic with you, adding to the congestion? And what people need to understand is, again, and I keep saying that, and it sounds patronising, but, more people cycling and there's less people in cars. And so the road space is more available to people who need to drive, people who have got mobility issues, people who are working in white vans and need to get around. I don't want to penalise them. I don't want to stop them doing what they have to do. I want to stop all those kind of concessionary trips that could easily be either deferred or made in another way.
I think that's the pod's first shout out to the greatest chip shop on the planet, which is Albany Fish Bar. I'm taking that and running with it. I mean, we've talked enough about Cardiff, I think, probably for the moment. Yeah. Never enough for me or even you, but I think for the rest of our listeners who don't live in the greatest city on earth. Yeah. But I mean, one of the biggest transport issues we've had in Welsh politics for a very long time now is the issue relating to HS2 Barnet consequentials. What's your view on that?
Right. So I first gave evidence on this very matter. I first made the public of Wales aware of this in 2011 because I gave evidence to the Transport Committee review of high-speed rail. And I'd read the report produced by Greengage about the economic impact on Wales that no one else had read. And I'd also worked out that, because of the way Barnet works and high-speed 2 would end up being a DFT line item, that we'd get shafted on Barnet consequences in future. So I raised it in 2011. I appeared on Radio Wales the morning I appeared at Westminster with Robert Bethan, I've forgotten it. And I made the point, didn't really understand it. No one knew about it. I think even Stuart Cole didn't even know there was an issue. I mean, and I was told, it's not a big deal. I knew there was a problem. And it clearly is a problem because what's happened now with High Speed 2, and it's not just High Speed 2, it's all network rail spend is defined as England and Wales. And what I came to it, I had to do a lot of reading. Barnet's very complicated. It's not simple. And it's not at a project level it's calculated, the Barnet allocations. It's at department level, at the Department for Transport level. And how it works basically is any change to the department budget, Wales will get 5% times something called a compatibility factor. And that's a factor that kind of reflects the number of line items that are devolved and non-devolved based upon their share of the capital of the departments. Now, when High Speed 2 was very small and Network Rail wasn't even in a department's budget, Wales's compatibility factor was nearly 95%. So any change to the department's budget, you get 5% on that 95%. So a fair allocation. Since 2015, of course, Network Rail's costs have gone onto the Department of Transport book, and High Speed 2 costs have been doing it, basically. So the compatibility factor for Wales now for calculating Barnet payments is now only 33%. So any change to the department budget from whatever source, right, will generate the Barnet calculations. It's 5% times whatever it is, but times 33%. So we only get a third of what we should get every time. The other thing, of course, has happened recently in the last budget. The Department of Transport budget didn't change. It's gone down, right? So the problem, of course, now is we never got an adjustment to the block grant for rail or for High Speed 2 in the first place. And any adjustments are not happening anyway because the DFT budget's been squeezed. And what the DFT have been doing, because the Treasury have asked them, is cut all the other stuff because you've got to finish High Speed 2, none of which helps Wales. So we have got a massive problem cooked into a decision made way, way back not to devolve rail. I mean, I don't want to unpack that. But had that decision gone the other way, and had it been devolved properly, like it was in Scotland, yeah, we'd have got a few things wrong. We didn't know how to do it because we didn't have any expertise. But now we'll be looking at, a block grant transfer to the Senedd a lot higher than it has been for the last 20 years. Now, whether that money will go into rail or transport becomes a local political issue, right? But at least it will be our choice and more democratically accountable. I emailed the new transport minister in London yesterday, and I said, look, you know the issues. The officials have heard from me. Your predecessors have heard from me. I can see about £80 billion still of transport rail enhancements on the books of the DFT out to 2040 in England. Finishing High Speed 2, Euston, Trans-Pennine upgrades, Northern Powerhouse Rail, East-West Rail, call it 80 billion. Now, forgetting Barnet, if we just took a population share of that, Wales should be looking at about 4 billion over the next 15, 20 years, shouldn't it? I can only see about 400 million on the books, you know, which is a lot less than we should be getting. Now, I know that they're not going to devolve it, and actually that wouldn't be the answer at the minute. There needs to be a ring-fenced fund for Wales that reflects this underfunding, but also is commensurate with the money being spent in England. And I think it's been great that now it's got much more public awareness, and people like my brother did the work. High speed 2 is a metaphor for all that's wrong in how we fund rail in Wales vis-a-vis the rest of the UK, because it's a bloody mess. And I've written about this. There's a very long section of my book about it. If anyone's got the determination to get through that, the 6,500 words I put to it, but it's complicated. It really is. But when you read it and understand it, you go, we're really getting shafted.
So, I mean, there's been a change in the figure that some people say Wales is owed. So it's gone from 4 billion to 350 million.
No, that was a game. So what again, if you don't understand how Barnet works, and you say, oh, had high speed 2 been defined as England only, and forgetting all the other network rail cost, the compatibility factor, because of what high speed 2 had been spent between 2016 and 2022, the compatibility factor would have gone from 35% to maybe 50%, right? It's still half of what we should have had for that 5-year period. Right? Again, the answer was correct mathematically, but actually it obfuscated, and it was deliberately meant to misrepresent the reality of the problem, which really annoyed me, because I think it was done before the election to try and take the heat off, the Labour Party in Wales. I thought it was unhelpful and slightly dishonest in terms of how I was presenting, because if you look at the numbers, yes, mathematically correct, but not a fair reflection. And this is why I say to people, it's not just high speed 2, it's the whole rail spend in the ecosystem has got a problem, because everything spent in England on enhancements is defined as England and Wales. And, there's £80 billion coming in the next 15 years, all of which is defined as England and Wales.
So when people say Wales is owed £4 billion for HS2, they're actually not being honest either, are they? We are owed £4 billion for DFT related spendings that should trigger a Barnet consequential, rather than it being a solely HS2 related funding issue.
And you could do, but then to try and explain how it all works and go, it's a good headline and the numbers about right. So
right, okay.
And I'll go with it, even though I know the numbers underneath are calculated differently. In my books, and I forget what the number I had is, I did some work for Welsh Government about 4 years ago, looking at the historical underspend since the year 2000, trying to work out because they never maintained figures for Wales until 2010, and even those are hard to get. Looking at the high-level output specs and looking at schemes like the West Coast Main Line upgrade and the station up, and you can find in Wales that there'd been nothing spent on enhancements, really, relatively, but billions in England. And I worked out the underspend, maybe was it a couple of billion between 2000 and 2021. High speed 2 to 2029 takes it to about 3 billion. And if you look at what's planned to 2040, takes it to 4 billion. So over that period, it's at least a 4 billion underspend. And rather than spend 15 minutes precursing every conversation to explain the Barnet formula, which is no guarantee of succeeding because I still struggle with it, just say, yeah, high speed 2, £4 billion, give us the money, right? That's just the easy way of doing it.
So, I mean, one of another major talking points in terms of Welsh transport infrastructure is the line between Aberystwyth and Carmarthen. What is your take on that much fabled, much discussed project?
Right. So one of the things I help Transport for Wales do, and I go back to my work with Ken Skates and Welsh Government in 2018, is trying to look at the priorities for rail investment in Wales. Now, romantically, I love the idea of it, right? But you look around the only other priorities we have, more stuff in Cardiff. There's a really good scheme for Swansea, which is going to struggle to get funded. North Wales Main Line, Borderlands, Cardiff Crossrail, all more important. And the reason I say that is to reopen Aberystwyth Carmarthen in heavy rail terms, and I did some work on looking at lighter rail options, heavy rail terms is going to be about £1 billion. And the population catchment, and it's the long-term operational cost is the real thing that bites you. The population on that line, probably no bigger than the Cordon line in Cardiff. Or Cordon and Seat line. There isn't a good local demand to justify £1 billion. It's like spending £1 billion on a railway that people might use a bit, but it would just be a massive subsidy and a massive cost. There's a really good bus service now called the T1 with electric buses. I've used it. I've been up to Carmarthen, got on a bus, and you end up in Aberystwyth. It works. I'd rather we focused on the economically important interventions. So that finishing Cardiff off, which is important. I think Swansea deserves something. There's a really strong case for something in Swansea. I think the borderlands between Liverpool, Merseyside, and Wirral down to Wrexham, maybe beyond, the North Wales Main Line. And then if we're going to look at the West, and I do think we should, you've got to do two things. You've got to come up with a lower cost option, which is not heavy rail, it's a lighter rail option. I did some work for TfW. We asked Stadler, could you do a long distance tram train, for example? Yes, they could. So you can kit something up for long distances. A lighter vehicle has less weight through the axles on the track, so your track form can be built to a different specification. The vehicles can still operate on a heavy rail. So I'd be looking at a shorter route. I'd be looking at, Bangor, Carnarvon, around to Portsmouth. Massive tourist market. There's a reasonable catchment population. It's not huge. It probably is marginal, and it's not going to be a priority. But I'd be looking at that. I then look at someone like the Moat Road built again and create a north-south link that kind of comes around the Cambrian line through the middle of Wales, down the Heart of Wales line, down to Swansea. Because one of the things we don't want to do is add loads more rail network asset to manage that's poorly utilised. The Heart of Wales line, actually, if you were being really tough about it, you close it. That's a very expensive piece of infrastructure that requires a lot of maintenance. And again, it's poorly used. If we're going to introduce more rail asset, that means that what we already have could be better utilised. Then you can make a case for doing something. But so romantically, I love it. Financially and practically, I think there are better options for north-south connectivity in the West. But the priority in the next 10, 15 years is going to be fixing stuff that should not have been a problem had we had funding like England had over the last 15 years. So the South Wales Main Line, electrification of Swansea, Swansea Metro, Cardiff Crossrail, the burnt stations, upgrade the Marches Line, get the North Wales Main Line sorted out with commuter services, and get border lines up to 4 trains an hour integrated with Merseyrail. And then, that will take us 15, 20 years if we had the money.
Easy there. That sounds easy. Like the easy checklist of stuff to do. Take no time at all.
Well, the point is there. I'd say because of the work we've done and TfW done, we pretty much know what we need to do.
Yeah.
And we've actually got reasonable business cases now, if not a full, but outline business case for a lot of that. And we're now up against, we know what to do now because we spent 6 years doing it and I've helped some of that. And there's some brilliant people at TfW and others been pursuing this and working these up. We're now going to, how are we going to fund this? I mean, we've done the work. We've satisfied a policy on decarbonisation and on mode shift. We've done the business cases, and Welsh Government, to their credit again, it's a non-devolved area, funded a lot of that work. There was some UK government work on the burn stuff with the UCR that Boris Johnson kicked off, and Sir Peter Hendy endorsed. But now the problem, of course, is we've got probably £2.5 billion of rail enhancement schemes that do make sense that we need to deliver, 2.5, 3 billion maybe, and absolutely no capital capacity to deliver that unless UK government goes, you know what, we have shafted you guys for 30 years. We can't give it to you all now, but here's a big slug. If you could put some money in as well, let's put a 20-year program together and start fixing this stuff. And I think that's what should happen. I remain naively optimistic that something like that will happen. But as I've known, from the past, sometimes we can be, we can kid ourselves. And I hope I'm not kidding myself. But otherwise, it ain't going to happen. And Carmarthen Aberystwyth will never happen because of that, right?
We've talked a lot about England, but we should probably talk about their plans actually for what the new UK Labour government are trying to do with transport. So they've just passed the rail nationalisation bill. They themselves want to re-regulate the buses, but let's focus on rail nationalisation for the moment. Do you think there's anything that the UK government can learn from the TfW experience, and how do you think rail nationalisation will impact Wales?
Two things. I think the conversation really is a bit misplaced because, the biggest part of the rail network with the biggest costs requires the most work is the asset which Network Rail have been managing under public ownership since 2003. So the bulk of it's been nationalised anyway. The rail operating companies, yes, there were margins in some cases that were going out to balance sheets, but not that much. The biggest cost and the biggest issue that I think Peter Hendy's facing, and I'm sure he'll admit that, is the rolling stock companies. They're not being brought in. So the financing cost of all that rolling stock, which the risk being taken by the Roscoes and private equity or whatever, that bit is not being brought in this bill. And that's, for me, what should be brought in so we can manage and invest in our own rolling stock rather than having to pay finance houses, which is what has been happening, where that's where the biggest costs are. So I think the nationalisation about saving lots of money is a bit misplaced because I don't think it will. What it will do, or what it could do, in my view, I think the biggest challenge we have, and there's a little story here. I had a chat with a Network Rail executive about 8, 9 years ago, and I was reflecting on what happened post-privatisation in 1997. And I said, you know what happened, didn't it? It wasn't just a functional split between the people who were managing the asset and the people who were running the trains. There was a big cultural split. So all the people who wanted to be front of house and innovative and, comb their hair nice for the past, for the customers went to the rail operating companies, And all the people who liked the kind of spades and the shovels and the process went to Network Rail. And I said, not being, unkind, if you read H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, all the Eloi went to the Tox and all the Morlocks read the Network Rail, right? So people who read the book will understand that. I said the problem, of course, now we've got this bifurcated culture into set of organisations, which I think is going to be really difficult to fix. Now, for me, the best way of addressing that is not creating this massive GBR railway. You can't do Wales anyway, because Transport for Wales are doing a lot of the thinking and strategic stuff. We need vertically operated units, right? And you need the ORR to manage the interface on standards and regulation. So I would be creating regional bodies, right? Like you would do in other countries. So there's a TFW becomes responsible for strategic development, funding, and the OMR, the maintenance of the asset. Network Rail in Wales becomes an asset management organisation working with TFW on managing the rail network. I was in Leeds 2 weeks ago at a catapult with Tracy Brabham on their plans for trams. And the real problem in the UK is, and I did a similar thing in Bristol, any time anybody wants a significant amount of money, they've got to go cap in hand to the Treasury. And my comment in Leeds was, they got a bit of money from the government now to look at the tram, or mass transit. I said, but at some point, you're going to have to walk down to the Whitehall and ask the Treasury for £2.5 billion. I said, what chance is that going to happen, really? So unless we devolve the funding and the accountability and we create organisations that are regionally focused, that are vertically integrated, I think we're going to struggle. And creating this great, big, huge national GBR monolith that doesn't properly address the cultural differences between operators and track asset management and doesn't reflect regional accountabilities and responsibilities, I think it will struggle. And I think that's the challenge for the GBR team, creating local organisations that lead on what's needed locally. And I assert, I am talking too much, had that vertically integrated autonomous bodies existed in Wales and say West of England or Liverpool 20 years ago, we would have done the burn stuff 20 years ago, because that would have been important to us. We would have done the borderland stuff. There would have been a Northern Powerhouse Rail and a Birmingham Manchester thing, because all these decisions are made in London by a handful of politicians and officials within a mile of Whitehall. That is not good for the UK, and it doesn't bode well if we're not going to address that issue, me.
Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you this evening. Your book, How to Build a Metro, is out and available for those who want to read it. But where can people find you on social media to hear more from you?
Well, I'm now on Blue Sky. I'm Blue Skying, and it's South Wales Metro, S Wales Metro Prof on B Sky, B Social. I still got a Twitter thing, but I've that bin fire is, I think I'm about late behind now. Blue Sky.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. You can find Hiraeth on all the socials. I'm reliably informed we've set up a Blue Sky. At Hiraeth Pod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/Hiraeth Pod. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.